Detective Stella Ross has one mission: get close to Ethan Crowe and gather evidence that will finally connect him to Richard Sawyer's murder. The plan is simple: infiltrate his world, gain his trust, and end the case once and for all. But nothing about Ethan Crowe is simple. As Stella weaves herself into his family's life, posing as his sister's friend from the art community, she finds herself face to face with one of Boston's most powerful men. He's brilliant, controlled, and far more dangerous than the file suggested. The closer she gets, the more the lines blur between duty and desire. And when Ethan kisses her in the shadows of his study, Stella realizes she's made a terrible mistake. Not in her investigation, but in believing she could keep her heart out of it. Then the call comes, the one that changes everything. The police are moving in, the evidence is damning, and Stella's cover is about to be blown. When a man like Ethan Crowe discovers you've been lying to him from the very beginning, when he realizes everything between you was part of an investigation, what does he do? Stella is about to find out. If you enjoy emotionally rich stories with unexpected twists like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. It really helps us bring you more incredible stories. Now back to where we left off. In Brookline, Ethan Crowe sat alone in his study when the phone rang. The room was built to absorb sound: heavy shelves, dark wood, leather worn to a dull sheen, the kind of space designed for decisions that were not meant to echo. He didn't look at the phone at first. It rang again. When he answered, he did not speak. "Ethan," his lawyer said, breath already tight, already managing distance. "You need to listen carefully." Ethan Crowe knew before his lawyer Marcus even finished the first sentence that everything he'd built over the past 15 years was about to come crashing down around him. When he spoke again, it was very quiet. "She's a cop." Marcus was still talking, his voice taking on that clipped professional tone he used when things were very bad and getting worse. He was explaining that someone had found evidence linking Ethan to Richard Sawyer's murder. The police were on their way to seal his company headquarters and search his properties. They had a warrant for his ships and his office and probably for his arrest. The words kept coming like punches that Ethan couldn't block or dodge. He tried to focus on what Marcus was saying about lawyers and rights and the process they would follow, but his mind had snagged on that one name and wouldn't move past it: Stella Ross. Ethan closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, then opened them again, already reaching backward through memory, aligning moments that had not asked permission to be understood until now. He ended the call without goodbye. Ethan stood, bracing both hands on the desk, shoulders squared, head lowered. The anger did not move through him explosively. It gathered, dense, compressed, the kind that did not dissipate quickly and did not forgive error.
"Damn you."
And the word felt inadequate for the magnitude of what he was feeling. Felt like trying to describe an ocean with a single drop of water, but it was all he had. His thoughts kept circling back to the way she'd looked at him last night when he'd kissed her in this very study, the way she'd responded with what he'd believed was genuine desire, the way she'd smiled at him afterward like he was something precious that she wanted to protect. He found himself remembering with painful clarity the first time he'd found her in this study several weeks ago, when everything had still felt possible and untainted by the truth. She'd been standing by his bookshelves, examining the titles with that curious intensity she had. He'd walked in to find her there, looking slightly guilty, like she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. Instead of being angry, he'd been charmed by the flush that had risen in her cheeks when she'd explained that she was looking for the bathroom and had gotten lost.
"Your study is beautiful."
He remembered the way she said it, as if beauty were an attribute she assigned sparingly. He'd believed her. Why wouldn't he? She'd seemed so genuinely embarrassed and interested in his collection of first editions. They'd ended up talking for an hour about literature and architecture. That had been the first mistake. She had entered their lives quietly, introduced as Juliet's co-worker from the community art space, someone who helped curate, someone who listened, someone who did not ask questions that demanded answers. They shared stories in fragments, similar losses, similar disappointments with people who should have known better. Their conversations were easy. Juliet had liked her almost immediately. Ethan had not. He had been against the idea initially because they rarely invited strangers into their home, because he'd spent too many years protecting his mother and sister from people who wanted to use their connection to him, but Jules had been insistent in that quiet, determined way she had, and eventually he'd surrendered because he'd never been able to deny his sister anything she really wanted. He remembered the first time he'd seen Stella at their home. He'd been working in his study and had glanced out the window to see her standing in the garden with Jules. Something about the way the afternoon light caught her hair had made him pause. Juliet talking too fast about a project she was excited about. Stella had stood slightly apart, hands loosely clasped, gaze lifting only when spoken to. She'd brought a lightness to Jules that he hadn't seen in years, and he'd found himself grateful for Stella's presence even before he'd met her properly, grateful that someone could make Jules laugh like that. When Olivia Sawyer reopened the case, Stella had already been there for weeks. Already trusted. That had been the second mistake. Their second meeting had been at an art gallery opening in the South End, one of those pretentious affairs that Ethan usually avoided but had attended because Jules was showcasing some of her work, and he'd found himself watching Stella instead of the paintings. She'd been standing in front of one of his sister's pieces with her head tilted slightly to the side, completely absorbed in the imagery, and when she'd noticed him watching her, she'd smiled with what had seemed like genuine pleasure at seeing him. She had said, nodding politely.
Mr. Crow.
Ethan.
She hesitated, then accepted it, as if names were not currency to her. The third time she'd come to their home, he'd made sure to be present for dinner instead of working late, had sat across from her at the table and watched the way she interacted with his family with such natural warmth that it made his chest ache. Stella fit into the house without trying to. She did not ask about Richard Sawyer. She did not circle Ethan with curiosity or fear. She treated him with a calm neutrality that was rare and therefore disarming. His mother had noticed the way he looked at Stella, had pulled him aside the next day, and told him that it was time for him to let someone in, that he'd been alone for too long, and that life was too short to waste on protecting himself from potential hurt. She'd said that Stella seemed like a good person, someone who could understand the complexities of his life, and he'd let himself believe it because he'd wanted it to be true so desperately that he'd ignored every instinct that would have normally kept him guarded. That had been the third mistake. Ethan remembered the night Stella came to him for help. She'd arrived looking nervous and slightly out of place in the glass and steel environment of his headquarters, and he'd been in a meeting when she showed up, so his assistant had shown her to his office to wait. When he'd finally gotten back to his office 45 minutes later, he'd found Stella standing in front of the large abstract painting that hung behind his desk, her head tilted back to take in the full scope of the canvas. She had touched nothing, left nothing disturbed. She'd finally told him what she needed help with, some story about a friend who was having financial troubles and needed advice. He'd offered to help without hesitation, but he'd told her with a slight smile that she'd have to pay for whatever assistance he was giving her.
I'll help you. But help has a cost.
She'd looked at him with those wide eyes,
What kind?
clearly wanting to know what the price would be. He'd enjoyed the way she seemed both nervous and intrigued by the question.
You'll find out.
He had deliberately not answered just to watch the uncertainty play across her face. She had left unsettled, curious. Later, she messaged him to thank him for his help and asking again what the price would be, and he'd replied that he thought a dinner would be fair payment, just the two of them, somewhere quiet where they could talk without the distraction of family or work. She accepted. The memory that hurt most, though, the one that made him feel like something vital inside him had been ripped away, was the night he'd found her in his study just a few days ago when everything had finally come to a head. The night she found the letter, he had been moving through the house without sound, his thoughts elsewhere, when he heard something shift in the study. He'd given her time to be alone, had thought she might want a moment to herself, or perhaps was planning some kind of romantic gesture. And when he'd finally followed her to the study, he'd found her standing by his desk with a letter in her hands, one of the old correspondences between him and Richard Sawyer that he'd kept filed away. She stood near the desk, one hand hovering over a drawer she should not have opened, breath uneven. The letter lay partially concealed beneath a ledger, old paper edged with time and implication. She had already taken the photograph. He knew that now. She'd looked up when he entered, and the guilty expression on her face had lasted only a fraction of a second before she'd hidden it behind a smile. Had set the letter down quickly and stepped away from the desk like she hadn't been doing exactly what it looked like she'd been doing. He'd asked her why she was in his study, and he'd seen her breath catch.
I didn't mean.
She stopped herself, swallowed. He stepped closer, slowly, gave her time to feel it.
This isn't where you wait.
He'd seen the way her pupils had dilated, and her pulse had jumped in her throat, and he'd interpreted it as attraction rather than fear of being caught. The air between them had felt charged with tension, and instead of questioning her further, he'd crossed the room and pulled her close. That had been the night of their first kiss, the night when he'd finally given in to the attraction that had been building between them for months and pulled her close in the shadows of his study, and she'd responded with an eagerness that had felt real enough to make his heart race. He remembered the way she'd tasted like the wine they'd had at dinner, the way her hands had fisted in his shirt like she was afraid he might pull away, the way she'd looked at him afterward with eyes that seemed to hold genuine affection, and he'd been fool enough to trust it, to believe that what was happening between them was as authentic as it felt intense. Now, standing alone in the same study, police on their way to dismantle his life piece by piece, Ethan Crow stared at the desk where his fist had landed. She'd played him perfectly from the very beginning, had studied him and his family and found all the weak points, had exploited his loneliness and his sister's kindness and his mother's hope that he might finally find happiness. Stella Ross had not stolen his trust. She had earned it. And that, he understood now, was the most dangerous kind of betrayal there was. Stella sat in Captain Wallace's office at the precinct with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and she tried to explain for the third time why she needed to be the one to get close to Ethan Crow, why this was the assignment that would make or break not just the case, but her entire career. And she could tell from the skeptical look on Wallace's face that he wasn't entirely convinced. The murder case had been closed for 10 years. Richard Sawyer, the business partner found dead 10 years ago in Boston Harbor. The case that had gone cold until Sawyer's daughter reopened it 6 months back. The investigation that had quietly been closing in on Ethan ever since. Stella had been the one to propose going undercover. Traditional approaches had failed. Ethan Crow was careful, insulated, and had not spoken to police since the night of the murder. The only way in was through a route he wouldn't anticipate. "You want to befriend his family," Wallace had said, making it a statement rather than a question. "You want to get close to his sister, gain their trust, infiltrate their home and their lives. You understand that's not investigation, that's manipulation of civilians who aren't suspects in anything." Stella had nodded because she did understand that, had thought about the ethical implications, and decided that finding justice for Richard Sawyer was worth the temporary deception. Had told herself that if Ethan Crow was innocent, then the investigation would prove it, and no lasting harm would be done. Wallace had seemed to consider this, and then he'd asked the question she should have hesitated over, whether she could maintain emotional distance, whether she could pretend without becoming. That had been 6 months ago, and now sitting in Wallace's office with evidence she'd gathered through methods that were ethically questionable at best, she was starting to realize that maybe she'd been wrong about her ability to stay detached. Juliet Crow had invited her home without suspicion, eager to share her world. The house in Beacon Hill was warm, lived in, filled with art and familiarity, and Margaret Crow had welcomed her as if Stella already belonged there. The ease of it all felt wrong. It made the deception heavier. Professionalism had always been easier before Ethan Crow had a face. Nothing had prepared her for the reality of standing in his garden while he watched her from the study window. Even from that distance, she'd felt the intensity of his gaze, had known instinctively that he was assessing her and trying to decide if she was a threat to his carefully protected family. Ethan Crow was not the kind of man who gave anything away easily. He was controlled and careful and clearly intelligent, and he looked at her with eyes that seemed to see more than she wanted them to. But then he'd smiled at something Jules said, and the transformation of his face had been startling, had shown her that underneath the careful control was someone who cared deeply about his family and would do anything to protect them. Their second meeting at the art gallery had been carefully orchestrated on her part, making sure she was there when she knew he'd be attending to support his sister, positioning herself in front of Jules's artwork so he'd have a reason to approach her. The third time she'd come to the house had been when things started to get dangerous, when she'd sat across from Ethan at the dinner table and felt the full force of his attention focused on her, and she'd realized with growing alarm that he was interested in her as more than just his sister's friend. The day she'd gone to Ethan's office at Crow Capital had been when she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She'd manufactured a reason to need his help. Left alone in his office for 45 minutes, she photographed what she could reach. When Ethan had finally returned from his meeting and found her standing in front of his abstract painting, she'd had to work hard to keep her breathing steady and her expression neutral, had to pretend she'd been waiting patiently instead of rifling through his private documents. That night when she'd texted him asking about the payment, when he'd replied that dinner would be sufficient, she'd stared at her phone screen and tried to convince herself that this was all part of the job, that getting closer to him personally was the whole point of the operation. The night everything had finally come together. The night she'd found the evidence she'd been looking for. She'd been at the Crow House for dinner again, had become enough of a regular presence that the family barely noticed when she excused herself. She'd known from previous visits that Ethan kept files from his time with Richard Sawyer in the desk drawer. She'd been waiting for an opportunity to search the study properly when the family was distracted. The letter she'd found had been exactly what she needed, correspondence between Ethan and Sawyer, that showed he'd threatened to report Sawyer to the Securities and Exchange Commission, that proved he'd had both motive and opportunity to kill the man who'd been his mentor. She'd heard Ethan's footsteps in the hallway and had quickly photographed the letter before shoving it back in the drawer. She'd turned to face him with her heart pounding and her hands shaking. Before she could process what was happening, he'd crossed the room and pulled her into his arms and kissed her with an intensity that had stolen her breath. She'd responded without thinking, her body betraying her even as her mind screamed that this was wrong, that she couldn't let this happen, that kissing the man she was investigating was so far over the line that there was no coming back from it. When they'd finally broken apart, she'd been dizzy with want and guilt in equal measure. She'd left the house that night with the photograph of the letter on her phone and the taste of him on her lips. Now, sitting across from Wallace with 6 months of deception behind her and feelings she hadn't planned for, Stella tried one last time to stay on the case. The evidence was solid. The letter established motive. The timeline held. After 10 years, the case could finally move forward. Wallace listened without interruption. When he spoke, his voice was calm in a way that made it worse. "Detective Ross," he said, "you're off the case, effective immediately. You'll be reassigned to patrol while Internal Affairs reviews your conduct. Detective Martinez will take over from here." The words hit her like a physical blow, and Stella felt her stomach drop even though she'd known this was coming. Wallace waited for her to argue. She didn't. Ethan Crow walked out of the Boston Police Department headquarters 48 hours after his arrest, looking like a man who'd been to war. The charges were dropped. The damage remained. Ethan did not look relieved. He did not look grateful. He listened as his lawyer spoke, nodded once, and got into the car without comment. The door closed. The city slid back into place around him. Inside the vehicle, silence stretched. "They'll try again," Marcus said eventually.
I know.
"And Stella Ross?"
Is not my concern anymore.
Marcus glanced at him. "She's been removed from the case." Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the windshield.
That doesn't make her harmless.
The car pulled away. The evidence Stella had gathered was presented to the judge. The letter she had photographed in Ethan's study. The financial records Ethan had kept, documenting Sawyer's crimes. Marcus had systematically demonstrated that far from being evidence of guilt, these documents proved that Ethan had been the one trying to stop Sawyer's illegal activities. The timeline didn't work, Marcus had argued, because if Ethan had been planning to kill Sawyer to prevent him from being exposed, why would he have kept detailed records of Sawyer's crimes that would only draw more attention to the whole affair? The judge had looked at all other evidences and considered the rest. A case closed for 10 years, reopened on the work of a single undercover detective who had become personally involved with the suspect. He'd made the only decision he legally could, which was to dismiss the charges pending further investigation that everyone knew would never materialize. Ethan had walked out of that courthouse a free man, but freedom felt like a technicality when his reputation had been shredded. He returned to his house in Brookline after dark. The gates opened without hesitation. The lights were on. Everything waited for him exactly where he had left it. His mother did not come to him immediately. Juliet did not leave her room. In his study, Ethan poured a drink and did not touch it. Stella Ross had betrayed him in the most fundamental way possible. She had used his family's trust and his own growing feelings to gather evidence that had nearly destroyed him, and the fury that followed was so complete it pushed everything else into irrelevance. Marcus had tried to convince him to file a civil suit against the police department for wrongful arrest and emotional distress. But Ethan had dismissed the idea with a wave of his hand because money and policy changes wouldn't undo what Stella had done. What he wanted existed outside legal channels, and it took most of the night for that to crystallize. He couldn't destroy her the way she'd tried to destroy him. She had no empire to strip away. But what she did have was a career in law enforcement that she clearly cared about, and that was something he could absolutely demolish if he chose to. By the time dawn broke over Boston, he'd made arrangements to ensure that Stella would be unable to contact him or his family under any circumstances. Her name was added to security lists, her number blocked, to redirect any communication attempts to his legal team. Juliet had been the hardest to face. She cried when he told her, locked herself away for 2 days, then asked quietly how friendship could be rehearsed like a lie. Margaret had raised them on mercy, and now that belief sat fractured, no longer whole enough to offer freely. 2 weeks later, the message came through the company's official inquiry line, flagged and forwarded by his assistant. It was from Stella Ross, asking him to please call her back or agree to meet about the Sawyer case, claiming the evidence didn't fit and that the wrong man had been chased. Ethan read it once, then he set the phone face down on the desk. He had already decided what mattered. Stella Ross did not. Not anymore. Stella knew something was wrong before she could explain why. She was pulled off the case and reassigned to patrol, but she kept digging anyway. Quiet, off the books, following the money trails that didn't make sense. She tried to reach Ethan the first time without thinking. The call did not go through. She tried again the next day, then the next. Her emails went unanswered. Her messages were not acknowledged. By the end of the week, the complaints began. Within a week, Internal Affairs had reopened her file. Allegations appeared from nowhere. Her badge privileges were stripped. Colleagues avoided her in hallways. Someone was destroying her career piece by piece. She knew exactly who. She did not stop. The night it happened, she had just finished cross-referencing a set of charitable disbursements tied to the Sawyer Foundation when the power in her apartment flickered. The building settled back into itself a moment later, old wiring complaining, nothing unusual enough to alarm her. She saved her work and stood to pour herself water, aware only in retrospect of the way her shoulders tightened as she crossed the room. The first blow came from behind. It was not a punch. It was impact, blunt and decisive, delivered with enough force to drive the breath from her lungs before pain had time to arrive. She went down hard, vision fracturing, the room tilting violently as she tried to orient herself. She did not see the second strike. She felt it as pressure, as weight, as something crushing inward rather than outward. Hands restrained her arms. Something connected with her ribs, once, twice, a methodical cadence that suggested intention rather than rage. She tasted blood. A voice spoke close to her ear, low and controlled. "You should have let it go." Then there was nothing. He didn't sleep that night, just sat in his study watching the sun come up over the city and thinking about how much simpler his life had been before Stella Ross had walked into it, and when his phone rang at 7 in the morning with an unknown number he almost didn't answer. Something made him pick up anyway, some instinct he couldn't have named, and when he heard the panic in the unfamiliar voice on the other end, his blood went cold. The caller identified himself as a detective from the Boston PD and said there'd been an incident involving Detective Stella Ross. She'd been attacked in her apartment the previous night and was now in the hospital in critical condition. Despite everything she'd done to him, he found himself demanding details about what kind of attack it had been and whether the police had any suspects. The detective said she'd been found by a neighbor after sounds of a struggle, beaten badly enough to require emergency surgery. The assailant had fled. When Ethan asked if the attack was related to the Sawyer case, the pause on the line answered before the words did. Ethan thanked him and ended the call, his mind racing with implications he didn't want to consider, and he found himself pulling up Stella's message again and reading it with new eyes. She'd said she'd noticed something in the evidence that didn't align with the official narrative, had said she believed the real killer was still out there, and now someone had tried to kill her. If Stella had uncovered the truth, then the threat hadn't ended. Every reason urged him to step back and let authorities take over. He didn't. He called Marcus and instructed him to secure Stella Ross's hospital room, discreetly and without delay, then ended the call before questions could form. He was already getting dressed when the decision finished settling, already reaching for his coat. His driver noted the change in destination without comment, and the car joined the morning traffic, moving toward the hospital. Ethan watched the city pass, aware only that he hadn't decided what he wanted from her, only that he needed to see her before anyone else did. Stella did not look like herself in the hospital bed. The room smelled of antiseptic and quiet urgency. Her face was swollen, mottled with color that did not belong there. A bandage wrapped her head, thick enough to obscure the shape beneath. Machines surrounded her, performing functions her body could not manage alone yet. Her chest rose shallowly, uneven, each breath assisted. Ethan moved closer. He stood at her side, gaze tracing the evidence of violence with the same precision he once reserved for balance sheets and contracts. Fractured skull, broken ribs, internal bleeding stabilized but not resolved. A body that had been punished for persistence. Ethan reached out, then stopped. His hand hovered just above the sheet, close enough to feel warmth, close enough that the movement would have been instinct rather than intention, and he withdrew it slowly, fingers curling back into restraint. He settled for adjusting the chair instead, the metal legs scraping softly against the floor, grounding him in something that did not require permission.
You should have stayed away,
He said softly, not to her, but to the space between them. There was no response. For the first time since his arrest, something inside him shifted that did not resolve into anger. It settled into resolve. By the time he returned to his office, a plan had begun to take shape. He pulled up the public record on Richard Sawyer's murder and reread the coverage from 10 years ago. The official account had always been simple. Sawyer shot late at night in his office. Ethan, the last person seen leaving after an argument. No weapon recovered. No other suspects pursued once the narrative settled. If Stella had found something that didn't fit, it wouldn't have been in the headlines. It would have been in sequence, in timing. He opened the files Marcus had compiled years ago. Sawyer's shell accounts, circular transfers, the financial exposure Ethan had threatened him with before his death. He began isolating names that appeared not on transactions, but on authorizations. He was still working when his assistant appeared in the doorway. "Olivia Sawyer is in the lobby," she said quietly. "No appointment." Ethan glanced back at the screen, at the list he'd just begun assembling. The timing ruled out coincidence. He told his assistant to send her in. Olivia wore charcoal instead of black, her hair pinned back with exactness. When she entered, she didn't perform confidence. She carried it as habit. Ethan didn't stand. She paused just inside the room, her gaze moving once over the office, desk, windows, the city beyond, before settling on him. The pause was measured, the kind that allowed her to decide what version of herself was most useful here. Mr. Crow?
Miss Sawyer.
He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk without warmth and watched her choose not to sit. I didn't come to discuss your reputation. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, the movement slow, unhurried, as if he had all day to listen to her shape the world to her liking.
You're here to tell me you're a victim.
Detective Ross was attacked, Olivia said, and the way she said Stella's name was careful, as if it were fragile or radioactive. You and I both know that wasn't random. It's not my style to pretend I believe in coincidence. Ethan's gaze held hers.
You're implying you had nothing to do with it?
Olivia's eyes narrowed by a fraction, offended not by the accusation but by the bluntness of it. I didn't order someone to beat a police detective to the edge of death, she said, and a thread of something like disgust slipped under the words, then vanished. If I were that reckless, I wouldn't have made it this far. Ethan didn't interrupt. He let the silence pull at her until she filled it, because people always did. Someone, she said quietly, wanted that arrest. Ethan's voice stayed even.
So this was a setup.
I'm saying the case was reopened loudly, a villain was fed to the public, and when it got inconvenient, it was shut down cleanly, Olivia replied. Meanwhile, the only person actually digging was removed, and then nearly killed. The word nearly landed like a stone. Ethan's voice stayed low.
Watch your assumptions.
Olivia's gaze didn't move. You hate me, she said calmly, and the statement landed without apology. You hate what my name does to your life. You hate what I represent. And you hate that you can't kill a rumor, no matter how much evidence you have. Ethan's eyes darkened, but he didn't raise his voice. Olivia stepped closer, not into his space, just close enough to shift the balance. I want the truth, she said, and there was something sharper under it now, something less polished. But right now, I need to know who is powerful enough to shove a police department around like furniture. Because if it isn't you, then it's someone who is comfortable harming anyone who gets too close. And I have no intention of being next.
You came here to recruit me.
I came to tell you this wasn't just about you, Olivia replied. They held each other's gaze, and in the quiet standoff, the shape of a new conflict emerged. Not over guilt or innocence, but over control, access, and what could be made to look true if the right hands applied pressure. Olivia turned to leave, then paused at the door. If Ross wakes up, she said, she's the only person who knows what she touched. Ethan didn't answer. Olivia left anyway. Stella woke on the 7th day with the slow, brutal awareness of a body that had been forced back into function. A nurse leaned over her, voice soft, calling her name, asking questions that required more strength than she had. Stella tried to speak and managed only a rasp that scraped her throat raw. Pain made her swallow hard and go still again. Stella's eyes tracked the room and caught the detail that didn't belong. Private security. She didn't ask who had hired them. The detective with the notebook began gently. Time, place, whether she'd been seeing anyone, whether she'd had threats, whether she'd been working on anything outside her assignment. Each question was phrased as if the answer were expected to be simple.
I didn't see their face. A man.
The detectives exchanged a brief glance that suggested impatience dressed in professionalism. They asked several more questions. When the detectives left, the room did not feel safer. It felt emptier. Ethan Crow did not go to the hospital. He read the reports instead. Twice. Once for information, once for pattern. He knew better than to step into corridors lined with uniforms and questions while the city was still deciding what version of him it preferred. So he waited. Stella Ross left the hospital 8 days later through a side entrance. Her arm was braced against her ribs. Her gait was measured, precise, controlled to the edge of what she could afford. No press, no statement. A department-issued car dropped her at her building and drove away without ceremony. Her apartment smelled wrong when she stepped inside. A faint chemical trace over dust and old wood, the residue of strangers. Furniture had been moved, returned, not quite correctly. Drawers were closed, but not the way she closed them. The silence felt provisional. She lowered herself onto the edge of the couch and stayed there, breathing carefully until it steadied. The dark television screen reflected her back at herself. Paler, thinner, bruises fading, but not gone. She looked like someone who had been put down hard and gotten back up without permission. The phone rang while she was still sitting there, hands resting loosely in her lap. When she answered, there was no greeting.
What do you have?
The voice was calm, unadorned, stripped of anything that could be mistaken for courtesy. Ethan did not ask how she was. He did not acknowledge the distance between them, or the fact that this was the first time they had spoken since everything had come apart. He did not soften the demand by turning it into a question. Stella closed her eyes briefly, the movement small but deliberate, as if she were acknowledging a blow she had anticipated. Something flared in her chest, offense, reflexive and sharp, but it didn't rise all the way to anger. She had done worse to him than this. She knew that. The thought settled the reaction before it could find words.
Not on the phone.
Her voice roughened by disuse and pain medication she had already stopped taking because she disliked what it did to her thinking. There was a pause on the line, long enough for her to hear the city moving faintly behind him, traffic muted by glass and elevation. She pictured him where he always was when he wanted control, somewhere high, somewhere quiet, somewhere designed to give him time.
You don't get to dictate terms.
Stella shifted slightly on the couch and felt her ribs protest, the pain clean and immediate, a reminder that her body had not yet agreed with her intentions. She waited until it passed before answering.
I know, and I'm still not saying it on the phone.
Another pause. This one felt heavier, as if he were deciding whether to end the call or change tactics. And Stella understood that this was where his danger lived, not in volume or threat, but in the way he recalibrated without warning when something stopped responding the way it should.
You were willing to say enough to get my attention. You can say enough now.
Stella's gaze moved to the window, to the thin strip of street visible between buildings, to the ordinary life passing through it without awareness.
You weren't listening then. You were angry. You still are.
Silence stretched again, tightened by the implication that she knew something about him he would have preferred she forget.
Where?
She hesitated, not because she was afraid of him, but because saying the address would make this real in a way that neither of them could retreat from.
My apartment.
The line went silent, but he did not hang up. She could feel him there, measuring, mapping the implications of being seen entering her building, of being associated with her now that she had become something untidy and unresolved. She knew that calculation intimately. She had lived inside it for 6 months.
I'll send a car.
The call ended without goodbye. Stella set the phone down and leaned back carefully. She closed her eyes, not in exhaustion, but in preparation. Whatever she had uncovered had already taken enough to make further damage feel abstract. And if Ethan Crow was now part of the equation, the margins for error had narrowed even further. Across the city, Ethan stood by the window of his office with the phone still in his hand, watching traffic knot and unknot below, as if nothing irreversible had occurred. Whatever Stella Ross had found had been dangerous enough to silence her once, and dangerous enough that she still refused to name it aloud. That told him more than the words she had withheld. He placed the phone on the desk and pressed a button without looking at it.
Prepare the car, and make sure it doesn't draw attention.
When the line went dead, Ethan remained by the window a moment longer, his reflection faint in the glass, the city layered behind it. He had waited because waiting had been necessary. Now it was no longer useful. Whatever she had was finally within reach. And this time, he intended to see it before anyone else decided it should disappear. Stella sat in the back seat of the car Ethan Crow had sent, her hands folded loosely in her lap, every movement measured as the city slid past the darkened windows without acknowledgement. The car did not stop in front of the building. It slowed, adjusted its angle, then disappeared into an underground entrance without signaling itself to the street above. Stella felt the shift in pressure before she saw the concrete walls close in, the city sealing itself off behind them. The driver did not look at her when he opened the door. He didn't offer help. He waited. She moved on her own. Her ribs still resisted sudden motion. Her balance had improved, but not enough to forget caution. She followed the driver down a short corridor and into an elevator that rose in near silence. When the doors opened, there was no hallway, only a private foyer and a door already unlocked. Ethan was inside. He stood near the windows with his back to her, jacket removed, sleeves buttoned, the city laid out beneath him in hard lines of glass and water. The apartment was spare and immaculate, built for function rather than comfort. Nothing on the surfaces suggested sentiment. Nothing invited rest. The door closed behind her. Ethan didn't turn.
You stopped playing it carefully, detective.
His voice level, uninflected. Stella stood where she was and let it pass through her, the sting sharp and brief, the kind that came from being seen too clearly. He had earned the right to say it. She had given him that right herself.
I should have.
Stella stepped farther into the room and stopped, aware of how exposed she felt without the armor of official spaces or hospital staff or anything that resembled neutrality. This was his ground. He had chosen it deliberately. Ethan turned then, slowly, his expression composed into something unreadable. His gaze moved over her with precision, lingering on the bruises she couldn't fully conceal. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a folded envelope, worn at the edges, the paper softened by handling. She did not cross the room to give it to him. She set it down on the table nearest her and stepped back, as if proximity itself were a negotiation. Ethan watched the envelope for a moment before moving. When he did, it was with the same controlled economy he brought to everything that mattered. He didn't open it immediately. He turned it once, reading the handwriting on the front, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly at the sight of it.
Where did you get this?
Stella leaned lightly against the back of a chair, the contact grounding her.
It was misfiled. Not hidden, just placed where no one would think to look for it twice.
Ethan opened the envelope and slid the contents free. A photocopy. Financial routing details, precise enough to be boring, dangerous enough to be lethal in the wrong order. Dates, accounts, a transfer that did not belong where it had been recorded, a correction that had been made months after Sawyer's death and signed off by someone whose name Ethan had trusted for years.
This doesn't prove murder.
No.
Ethan looked down at the paper, his thumb pressing briefly against the margin where the name appeared, the pressure controlled, contained.
This person has been in my life longer than you have.
I know. That's why I didn't say it out loud.
You understand that if this is wrong...
It isn't.
Ethan's gaze lifted to hers, sharp now, stripped of detachment.
Why should I trust you?
The words carried weight he did not allow to surface elsewhere. Stella's mouth tightened. She didn't look away.
You shouldn't.
She paused, long enough for the silence to settle into something deliberate.
It doesn't matter whether you trust me. It matters whether you're willing to dismiss what's in front of you because I'm the one who found it.
Another pause, smaller this time. Controlled. The logic of her argument hung between them, undeniable and infuriating. She was right, and he hated that she was right, hated more that he wanted to trust her.
You don't investigate anymore. You don't speak to anyone about this. You don't move without my knowledge.
Stella straightened, the effort visible.
You don't get to own this.
Ethan stepped closer, stopping just short of invading her space, the distance deliberate, the proximity intentional.
I already do. You brought it to me.
Stella held his gaze for a long moment, then looked away first. Not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. She had brought it to him, and in doing so, she'd given him exactly what he'd lost when she'd betrayed him. Control. He did not call Marcus. He pressed a button on his phone and spoke to the head of his private security detail, a man who never asked why and never offered comfort. Ethan gave the instructions in the same even tone he used when closing a deal or ending one.
Find out where he is. I want his day mapped before he realizes anyone is watching it.
A brief pause followed. The question that might have come did not.
And Stella Ross. 2 men, not close enough to make her feel trapped. Close enough to make her difficult to reach.
Understood. Ethan ended the call and stood at the window, hands in his pockets, the city spread below him like a grid of moving parts. For the first time since Stella had been dragged into his life and torn back out of it, he allowed himself to consider the simplest version of her betrayal, that she had been inside his family and his home, with a purpose that was never him, and yet the only thing she had given him now was a truth that hurt more than any lie. He did not raise his voice after she left. He remained where he was for a long time, the document on the table between the glass of the city and the quiet of the apartment, a single sheet of paper that had the audacity to sit there like an accusation without offering the comfort of certainty. Amount, $5.2 million. Destination, Grand Cayman Trust. Account number 847392. Authorization signature, the slant of the M, the loop of the C. A hand he'd trusted across contracts, briefs, settlements, across the paperwork that had secured his release days ago. Ethan's hand stopped moving. He read the routing again, slower this time, not for meaning, but for habit. For the small inconsistencies that surfaced when you stopped reading like a person and started reading like a system. The correction filed months after Sawyer's death. The entry made to look routine. The approval code that had belonged to the same individual for more than a decade. Marcus Chen, legal counsel. He's had been there the whole time, not as his lawyer, not as his friend, as something closer. Every piece of advice Marcus had given him shifted shape. Every strategy, every careful management of Ethan's public and private life. The realization arrived with the force of nausea. Ethan hadn't built his empire on his own terms. He'd built it in the shape Marcus needed, in the shape that kept Marcus safe. He had wanted revenge. What he was feeling now was not revenge. It was clarity, cold and functional. And because it was functional, it was worse. Ethan did not confront him immediately. That would have been emotional, predictable. And Marcus Chen had built an entire career on anticipating the predictable reactions. Instead, Ethan resumed his life as if nothing fundamental had shifted. He allowed Marcus to continue speaking into the familiar silences where guidance had once lived. The first test was simple. Ethan asked Marcus for the original escrow files related to Sawyer Investment Group, framed as a due diligence cleanup request prompted by recent publicity. Marcus responded within the hour, calm, accommodating, slightly amused at the bureaucracy of it all. He sent over what Ethan already had copies of, clean and complete, and exactly what a careful man would provide. Nothing extra, nothing missing. That told Ethan more than a mistake would have. The second test required patience. Ethan requested a quiet meeting at Marcus's office rather than his own, citing privacy. Marcus agreed without hesitation, offered coffee, commented lightly on how strange it felt to be on the defensive after years of partnership. He spoke about strategy, about rebuilding, about the long game. He did not ask why Ethan's eyes had gone cold. Ethan let him talk. It was only when Marcus mentioned Stella, dismissively, professionally, as a problem already solved, that Ethan interrupted. By the time Marcus realized that Ethan had not denied the implication, it was already too late. That night, the power went out in Stella's building again. Stella was awake when it happened, sitting at the small kitchen table with a glass of water she hadn't finished, the ache in her ribs a constant reminder that recovery was a suggestion rather than a fact. The lights cut cleanly. No warning, no transition. She didn't move. She listened. The city made a sound when it lost electricity, a collective exhale followed by distant sirens and confused machinery. But inside her apartment, there was only the hum of absence, Then the lock clicked. Once. Carefully. When Ethan stepped outside Marcus's office, the cold air hit him like a correction, and for the first time in days, the city felt physical again. Its weight, its movement, the way it could swallow people without leaving evidence. He understood now what Stella had been trying to tell him. Danger didn't announce itself. It moved first. The phone in his pocket vibrated. He answered without looking. His head of security spoke quickly. Movement near Ross's building. 2 vehicles parked too long in a place where nothing lingered without purpose. Ethan ended the call and dialed Stella, already knowing that if she didn't answer, he'd be on his way, with the assumption that he was already too late. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail.
Stella.
And her name sounded different in his mouth than it had a month ago. Ethan reached her building and took the stairs 3 at a time, the motion efficient rather than rushed, the kind of control that came from having already decided what he was willing to risk and what he was not. Without knocking, he used the key he'd obtained earlier, let himself into her apartment, and closed the door behind him, sealing the space the way one seals a decision. Stella was already on her feet when the door opened, eyes sharp, breath held just long enough to assess whether this was threat or interruption. Stella's breath went shallow, a controlled intake that didn't fully mask what it cost her to stand there, and Ethan saw in that moment how her vulnerability had become both liability and asset. She could not protect herself physically, not yet. But she could see the machinery for what it was, could feel shifts in pressure before others noticed, and that awareness was the reason she had nearly been erased.
Next time, you announce yourself.
He crossed the room and checked the windows, the secondary lock on the back door, the hallway beyond her apartment with a glance that missed nothing. When he turned back to her, the tension in his posture had shifted, not eased, but focused.
You're alive.
And you are reckless.
A corner of his mouth lifted without humor.
You taught me.
Another sound came from the hallway, footsteps moving with deliberate slowness. Whether the person wanted to be heard or felt safe enough not to care, didn't matter. Ethan treated it as threat. He didn't hesitate. He caught her wrist, firm but not rough, and pulled her against him as the door handle turned. Ethan didn't hesitate, reaching for her wrist with a grip that was firm but not rough, and pulling her against him in the same moment the door handle turned. The movement was abrupt enough to jar her ribs, sharp enough to steal her breath, but she didn't cry out. She didn't pull away. His other hand covered her mouth, not to silence her, but to anchor her there, solid and unmistakably real. The door opened, and someone stepped inside. Ethan leaned down, his mouth brushing her ear, his voice low enough to be mistaken for intimacy.
Stay still.
Her pulse raced under his palm. So did his. The intruder moved past the threshold, hesitated, then retreated, the door closing again with a sound that echoed too loudly in the dark. Only when the footsteps faded and the building settled into its night sounds did Ethan release her, though he didn't step back immediately, didn't create distance, and they stood inches apart, breathing each other in with the space between them, charged with something that was no longer just anger or betrayal or unfinished desire, but necessity.
This is no longer just my war.
Stella met his gaze, unflinching despite the pain.
It never was.
He nodded once, a gesture that sealed something between them that didn't require words, and then without warning or permission, he leaned in and kissed her. Not gently, because gentleness would have been a lie about what they were to each other, not slowly, because slow would have suggested they had time they didn't actually have, but with the controlled urgency of a man sealing an agreement neither of them could afford to speak aloud. It lasted only seconds before he pulled back, before it could become something else, something that would complicate what needed to remain clear, and his voice when he spoke was steady, even though his pulse wasn't.
Pack your bag. We're leaving.
Where are you taking me?
Ethan's gaze remained fixed on her.
Somewhere safe.
They moved quickly, down the stairs, out through a side exit into the narrow lane behind the building. A car door opened. She got in. Ethan slid in after her, and the door shut, sealing them into a space too small for distance. For a few seconds, neither spoke. The car turned, taking a route that avoided main streets, and Ethan felt the familiar pull of strategy, the slight relief of movement in a situation that wanted to become static and vulnerable.
Does he know you know?
He does now.
Thinking about the meeting earlier with Marcus. When they reached the apartment, it was not the one Stella had been in earlier, and it was not his home in Brookline. The apartment had 2 bedrooms separated by a narrow hallway, a place that had been designed for disappearances, quiet, controlled, with exits that could be used without being seen. Ethan walked Stella inside and closed the door behind them. For a moment, she moved through the apartment with the careful assessment of someone who'd been trained to map exits and sightlines and vulnerabilities, noting that the windows were bulletproof glass, that the door had 3 separate locking mechanisms, that the building itself was designed with security embedded into its architecture rather than added as an afterthought.
This is your idea of safe.
It's safe.
For now. The call came just after sunrise. Ethan didn't need to check the number. Juliet's voice was calm, which meant she was scared enough to be precise. She said there had been a change in her security detail, that the men assigned to her no longer matched the names Ethan had approved, that one of them had asked questions about her schedule that didn't belong to protection. Ethan ended the call without reassurance. Stella had slept on the couch because neither of them suggested the bedroom, and he had stayed awake in the chair opposite, watching the rise and fall of her breathing until dawn thinned the dark enough to matter. Now she lay awake. His expression settled into something grimmer than anger, something that looked like strategy sharpened by necessity, and he moved to the kitchen and poured himself water that he didn't drink, just held while staring at nothing.
He's making it clear that if I move against him, my family pays the price.
Ethan set the glass down with control that looked effortful,
Then we remove them from the equation.
and saw Ethan's gaze shift to her with something that might have been surprise.
We?
And the word carried a question he didn't fully voice.
Let me be the distraction while you get them out.
She moved to the counter where he stood.
You're injured. If something goes wrong,
I'm coming with you.
He looked at her, weighing injury against instinct, then nodded once.
then stay where I can see you.
She almost smiled. Ethan went quiet, working through the implications. Stella could see it in the way his focus narrowed, the way he began mapping moves and countermoves without speaking. He reached for the burner phone and began making calls to people whose names Stella didn't recognize, speaking in the careful code of someone who knew his communications might be monitored and who'd learned to say everything important without saying anything actionable. She listened to him arrange vehicles and timing and backup plans, watched him transform from the man who'd kissed her in the darkness of her apartment into something harder and more dangerous. This, she understood, was what he had built everything on, the ability to execute under pressure without hesitation. Extraction was clean, because it had to be. Stella stayed back, watching angles, noticing what didn't fit. The hesitation of a driver who should have been confident, the way one man reached for his weapon too early. She didn't need to run to be useful. She only needed to see. 2 hours later, Stella confronted Margaret Crow in a public restaurant, staging the encounter to ensure it would be seen. She accused Margaret of withholding information tied to new evidence in the Sawyer investigation, provoking a firm denial that played perfectly for anyone watching. The exchange was loud, tense, unmistakably public, exactly the distraction Stella needed. As expected, Margaret left with attention firmly on her. Stella waited just long enough to confirm the shift, then slipped out through a side entrance and into an untraceable car. Minutes later, Ethan's message came through. Juliet had been safely moved. Stella returned to the safe house by an indirect route. Ethan was already there with Juliet and Margaret, the room charged with relief and unspoken questions. Juliet took it in quickly. The setup, Ethan's instinctive half-step in front of Stella, the way Stella tracked movement even while bracing against pain. "You two planned that," she said.
We did.
After a tense silence and Ethan's quiet confirmation, Juliet offered a conditional, temporary trust, making it clear that a reckoning would come once the danger had passed. Ethan warned his family that Marcus Chen was dangerous and insisted they remain hidden until evidence could expose him. As Margaret assessed the situation, she quickly grasped the truth, recognizing that Stella had uncovered proof linking Marcus to Richard Sawyer's death. Margaret Crowe said nothing until later. Then she touched Ethan's arm once, gentle and final. "Don't let her face this alone," she said. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Marcus believed he was in control until the moment he wasn't. That was the mistake. The offshore accounts collapsed first, not publicly, not with headlines, but quietly, the way systems do when the wrong people begin asking the right questions in the wrong order. Trust structures froze. Compliance flags tripped across jurisdictions that did not speak to one another unless something had gone very wrong. Funds Marcus had treated as abstract, numbers arranged to obey him, stopped moving. Ethan did not touch the police. He touched regulators who did not need warrants to ask questions and did not care about intent. He touched banks that feared contagion more than litigation. He touched auditors who understood that survival meant distance. Stella built the spine of it. Dates aligned. Backdated authorizations surfaced beside contemporaneous metadata. Signatures authenticated not by handwriting, but by behavioral consistency, pressure, timing, sequence. Police brass appeared in the margins, not accused, just connected, their names placed carefully where journalists and internal review boards would eventually stumble into them. Nothing was leaked. Everything was prepared. Marcus noticed the shift when calls stopped being returned. Not ignored, deferred. Meetings postponed. Assurances softened. The city he had once moved through with invisible authority began to resist him. Doors still opening but more slowly, eyes no longer warm with familiarity. He called Ethan. "You chose her," Marcus said finally, disbelief edging the words. Ethan's voice was calm.
I chose to stop being managed.
That was when Marcus understood this was no longer reaction. It was execution. The arrest did not happen at Crow Capitol or in a courthouse corridor. It happened at Logan. 2 federal agents approached Marcus at the gate as he waited to board a flight he had booked under his own name out of habit, confidence eroding too late into caution. They did not raise their voices. They did not touch him immediately. They spoke in the careful cadence of men who already had what they needed. Marcus did not protest. He glanced once at the glass beyond the gate, the runway bright and useless, then lowered his eyes and complied. The charge sheet would come later. Money laundering, conspiracy, obstruction, accessory after the fact. Richard Sawyer's name appeared only once. By then, it didn't need to appear at all. 6 weeks later, Marcus Chen pled guilty to 8 counts. The sentencing hearing lasted 14 minutes. The judge spoke about betrayal of trust, about using position for personal gain, about the corruption of systems meant to protect rather than exploit. Marcus stood with his hands clasped, spine straight, face empty. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Marcus shook his head. The sentence came down without drama. 15 years, federal prison. Minimum security, but still prison. Still time that could not be recovered or negotiated away. Marcus was led from the courtroom without looking back. Ethan did not attend the hearing. He read about it later, in a 3-paragraph article buried on page 7 of the business section. The headline was clinical. Former attorney sentenced in corruption case. No mention of Richard Sawyer. No mention of Ethan Crowe. The case had been contained exactly as intended. He folded the paper and set it aside. 3 months later, the gallery opening was smaller than the ones Juliet used to avoid. Quieter. Intimate. The kind of space where people lingered rather than performed. Stella stood in front of one of Juliet's new pieces, a mixed media work of fractured mirrors and gold leaf titled Reconstruction. She studied it without touching the glass, careful of her reflection breaking into angles she didn't recognize. She knew Ethan was there before she heard him. She always did. He stopped a few steps behind her, close enough to share the space, far enough to leave it hers. He didn't rush her attention. He never did anymore. Juliet moved easily through the room, laughing with a collector, lighter than she had been in years. Stella tracked her without meaning to, the habit of vigilance still there, quieter now. Ethan followed her gaze.
She's different.
Not quite a compliment, not quite a question.
She's healing.
He nodded once, as if filing that away. They stood like that for a moment, the gallery noise receding into something distant and harmless. 3 months since Marcus had been taken into custody. 3 months since Stella had stepped out of the precinct for the last time. 3 months since she and Ethan had stopped speaking, because anything said too early would have been wrong.
I didn't expect you.
You made sure I knew where to find you.
She glanced at him then, saw the careful distance he kept, the way he'd learned to contain himself rather than disappear. Her phone buzzed softly. She frowned and checked it. A calendar invite. From Ethan Crow. Title: Thursday, 7 p.m. Location: not specified. No description. She looked up at him.
You didn't even add a note.
I didn't want to over-explain. You've had enough of that.
She studied the screen for a moment longer, then tapped accept. Juliet passed behind them just then, caught the movement and smiled to herself without slowing down. Ethan exhaled quietly, the tension easing by degrees.
No pressure.
Stella slid the phone back into her bag.
You don't get points for pretending there isn't.
He almost smiled. They stood together, the gallery lights warming as the night settled in, neither of them reaching for what came next, only agreeing not to walk away from it. And that's where our story ends. If you stayed until the end, I want to ask you something. Could you forgive someone who entered your life as a lie, even if they became the only person willing to fight for your innocence? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who understands how dangerous love can be when trust is a weapon and the truth has a price. Until next time, the study door remains open, waiting for the next story to unfold.